About 1100 AD, a group of people called the Aztecs came to the Valley of Mexico. In 1325, they settled near Lake Texcoco and on a marshy island founded the great city of Tenochtitlan. The Aztecs built 3 stone causeways to link the city to the mainland and brought fresh water from nearby springs to the city by means of aqueducts. Tenochtitlan was home to nearly 200,000 people. Since the city was built on an island, the Aztecs had no farmland to grow crops. To remedy this problem, they created floating gardens called chinampas. First, the Aztecs wove giant mats out of reeds. These mats were placed on the water and covered with mud, silt, and rotten vegetables. A fence was built around the mat, and willow trees were planted around the perimeter. The roots of the trees held the soil in place. The Aztecs grew corn, chili peppers, tomatoes, squash, avocados, and potatoes on the chinampas. The Aztecs had a 365-day calendar that they used to determine the best time to plant their crops. Religion was extremely important to the Aztecs. An additional 260-day calendar marked religious festivals and determined when to consult the gods. To worship, they built a 12-story temple, which came to be called El Templo Mayor. There, the Aztecs attempted to please the gods by offering human sacrifices. They believed that the gods needed the nourishment of human blood and hearts.
Sacrifice was necessary in the Aztec view in order to keep the sun rising every day, setting every evening, and coming up again the next day. In other words, it was necessary to sustain life here on Earth.
The Aztecs were a fierce and powerful people who conquered many other groups and captured many prisoners. The sacrifice of prisoners of war instilled fear in the other groups, making them easier to conquer. Every Aztec male was trained to fight, and it was considered an honor to take part in a battle. The Aztecs' power enabled them to develop a large empire that stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean and included 10 million people. All Aztec children were educated. Girls were taught how to cook and sew and trained for marriage. Male children of the working class attended schools where they were trained to be warriors. Noble male children were sent to schools called Kalmakoks, as were a few of the brightest lower-class children. There, priests taught them the history of their people and how to properly govern. But it was the religion and history of the Aztecs that contributed to the empire's downfall. In an ancient Aztec myth, the god Quetzalcoatl took many forms and was sometimes represented as a bearded white man, quite unlike the darker, beardless Aztecs. In the myth, the god took human form as a priest to give the Aztecs a new religion and stop the practice of human sacrifice. But Aztec priests believed the other gods would become angry and drove Quetzalcoatl out of the city. But he vowed to return from the east in the year Sealcoatl, bringing with him other bearded white men. In 1519, Hernan Cortez left the island of Cuba for Mexico. Cortez was a conquistador, one of the soldiers that Spain employed to explore and colonize the Americas. Cortez had about 500 men and 16 horses when he landed in Mexico. His first step was a bold one. He destroyed his entire fleet so that his men could not return to Cuba and had to accept his authority. Cortez befriended Native Americans along the coast and received gifts and women from their leaders. One of these women was named Melintzin, who became a translator and advisor to Cortez. She told Cortez about the Aztecs' capital city of Tenochtitlan and its riches. He also learned about the Aztecs' tendency to sacrifice their enemies to the gods. As he traveled through Mexico, Cortez befriended the enemies of the Aztecs and increased his force with fighters from the native groups. 3 months later, Cortez and his men reached Tenochtitlan.
It's bigger than anything they'd seen so far in Mexico. And this is a city of 250,000 people, way out of scale of what they'd already encountered. So it must have made your heart stop just for a moment to think of what they were actually walking into.
Upon Cortez's arrival, the Aztec ruler Moctezuma thought the prophecy had come true and Quetzalcoatl had finally returned. It was also the Aztec year Sayacatl, the year in which Quetzalcoatl said he would come back. Moctezuma was frightened that the god would take the kingdom. At the same time, he did not think he could treat a god poorly. Cortez and his men were greeted warmly and given gold and many other gifts. They were showered with lavish banquets and allowed to sleep in the ancient palace of Moctezuma's father. Cortez responded by taking Moctezuma prisoner and ruling the Aztecs through him. The Aztecs resented how the Spanish treated them, and months later, they rebelled. Cortez instructed Moctezuma to calm his people, but they responded to his pleas by hurling stones at him. He was struck on the head, a blow that resulted in his death a few days later. Aztec fighters then drove the Spanish out of the city, but Cortez rallied his forces and built a fleet that he used to surround Tenochtitlan. The Aztecs suffered from lack of food and drinking water. Many were also dying from diseases like smallpox that the Spanish had introduced to Mexico. After 80 days, the Aztecs surrendered and the Spanish burned Tenochtitlan to the ground. In its place, they constructed what is now known as Mexico City. After hundreds of years of prosperity, the great Aztec civilization was wiped out by the Spanish in less than a decade. How were children educated in Aztec society? What role did Aztec culture play in the conquest of the empire?